Hello, today I'm speaking to those of you who want to do more to support refugees, and I'm asking a couple of things of you in that context. The first is that I want your help to get refugees back on the agenda, and we can do this by getting behind a particular set of policies. Specifically, the key to helping us support the welfare and security of refugees and other vulnerable people is to build increased institutional capacity and outreach programs across the Indo-Pacific region. The second thing that I'm asking you is related to the first, and it is that you don't vote Green. In this context, we need to talk about the tragically failed policy of onshore processing. Greens continue to support that terrible policy, and they do it through the deliberate unremembering of 1,200 deaths at sea. I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I know the issue is close to the heart for many of you. I'm going to begin by looking at a graph that may be difficult for some of you. The graph shows the known deaths at sea of asylum seekers attempting to reach Australia by boat between the year 2000 and present day. And on the vertical axis, we have the number of deaths. On the horizontal axis, we have the year. This data is from the Australian Border Deaths database run out of Monash Uni, and it's the best data that we have. I've marked several events on the timeline so we can look at the deaths at sea in relation to those events. First, here in 2001, facing increasing political challenges with refugee boats, including with significant loss of life, John Howard was first to introduce offshore processing. So offshore processing is when a person who attempts to reach Australia by boat is taken to another country for processing. In this case, that was Nauru. The policy was criticised by many, including myself, as being excessively punitive and inhumane. However, we can see on the graph here that after onshore processing was introduced, for 7 years there were 0 recorded deaths at sea. The reason for this is that very few people were attempting boat journeys. Here in 2008, we see Kevin Rudd has reintroduced onshore processing, meaning that people on refugee boats were brought to facilities in Australia, with those determined to be genuine refugees allowed to stay. So over the next 5 years, around 55,000 asylum seekers got on a boat to Australia. Almost all of those people were subtracted from our regular humanitarian intake, meaning that very few extra people were helped. But meanwhile, more than 1 in 50 of those who got on a boat died at sea, around 1,200 total. Here we can see the number of deaths increasing year by year until Julia Gillard reintroduced offshore processing in 2012. In 2013, Tony Abbott introduced the Turn Back Boats policy, and since that time, for almost 12 years now, there has been 0 recorded deaths of this kind. I'm pointing the finger very squarely at the Greens here in relation to these deaths. While the Labor Party said sorry for getting their policy so wrong and for their role in these deaths, the Greens do not even count the deaths as relevant. Actually, it is worse than that. The Greens have tried to deliberately unremember those 1,200 deaths. In this context, we need to take a closer look at some of the strategies that the Greens have used to defend their continued support for onshore processing. The first strategy here I call convenient lies. So Senator Hanson Young told us that there are no pull factors. But the graph shows very clearly that onshore processing has provided a pull factor, which means an incentive for people to risk a boat journey to Australia, which has resulted in 1,200 deaths. There may have been a time when Hanson Young and the Greens, other Green leaders, actually believed that there are no pull factors, but that was long ago. Their continued reliance on that idea has become no more than a politically convenient lie. The second strategy that the Greens have employed here is enabling conspiracy theories. For example, for years, the Greens enabled the suggestion that the people are still dying, but the government is not telling us, to thrive on social media. But that is simply not true. If more than very few of these deaths occurred, we would find out about it. The third strategy that I've mentioned here is deeply flawed ethical argument. Also enabled on social media was the idea that those people would probably have died anyway. Actually, we don't know that because it is hypothetical, but we can say that a 1 in 50 death rate would be a cause for very serious concern in any other circumstance. The statement that those people would probably have died anyway implies that deaths at sea don't matter. Actually, we have a clear duty of care to prevent those particular deaths. Meanwhile, we can also work to prevent deaths elsewhere. Fourth strategy is supporting the clique by the shaming of outsiders. Perhaps this helps explain why the Greens have been unable to move on from their very sad and utterly failed policy. Rather than defending their own policy, Greens have instead relied on the use of insulting language towards anyone with a dissenting view. Here I want to tell you a bit of my own story, because I have seen this shaming of outsiders firsthand. I was previously a member of the Greens. I protested against John Howard and celebrated when Rudd, with Greens' support, restarted onshore processing. But then the deaths began. I cried as boat tragedy followed boat tragedy in the news. Like Julia Gillard and the Labor Party, I changed my policy. When I tried to engage with my former Green colleagues about the issue, I began to find that those strategies that I mentioned, with the lying and conspiracy theories, and I started to feel what it was like to be on the outside of a clique that is supported by the shaming of outsiders. I stuck to my guns, lobbying the Greens to mourn those deaths and to remember them in policy. I took a decade of abuse for my trouble. These days, the insults have mostly been replaced by an eerie silence. I've spoken to Adam Bant, Max Chandler Mather, Penny Allman Payne, Drew Hutton, John O'Shri Ranganathan. They do not answer. Larissa Waters has made no comment. Last year, when I ran as an independent for Brisbane Mayor, I rang a bell publicly 1,200 times in 12 hours as I criticised the Greens and asked them to mourn and remember those 1,200 deaths. But the Greens did not answer. Greens do not count those deaths as relevant. It boils down to one question: does onshore processing kill? The evidence suggests that there is only one correct answer. Onshore processing does indeed kill, but this is an answer that the Greens cannot say. They have invested so much in the clique, with the moral grandstanding, the shaming of others, that it is easier for them to deliberately unremember those deaths than it is for them to back away from their awful policy. So I ask you again, please do not vote Green. If you are connected to them, I'm sorry. Please let them know that you care about deaths at sea and ask them to change their policy. But the hobnob leaders have known about this for a long time. Please do not vote Green. So, those of us who would advocate for better outcomes for refugees have been divided amongst ourselves and weak. On the one hand, those that continue to support onshore processing are increasingly marginal. On the other hand, I think the majority of us who would look for a better way have been too silent. It is time to reset. It is time to put our most vulnerable people back on the agenda. There is a very clear direction that we can take. That is toward a program of increased institutional capacity and outreach programs across the Indo-Pacific region. We can do so much more for the Rohingya trapped in a refugee camp in Cox's Bazar. We can work to provide certainty for Pacific Islanders facing the threat of rising oceans. And we can do all of this and so much more, and we can do it while continuing to maintain disincentives against deadly boat journeys and people smuggling. It's time to get refugees back on the agenda. Don't vote Green. Thank you.